Okay, so as you can see, my community mapping project is centered on absenteeism at SF Community School, which is a K-8 school in San Francisco, and SFUSD in general. The initial impetus for this was transportation. It's still listed that way on the form, but actually it sort of evolved into more of a service-oriented solution, or actually direction. And I'll explain that as I move along, more or less through the story of research, peeling the onion. So the title here, Community Solutions Resource Starved, sort of encapsulates my findings thus far, and I'm hoping to take it further and continue looking deeper into this program. The question that started my research process came from Nora Hausman, who is a PLI, I think 13 grad, and she is principal at SF Community School, which is over in Excelsior in San Francisco Unified. A nice picture of which you see here. I couldn't get the map to copy over to the slideshow, so. But the question she wanted me to ask and wanted help with there is, why are students chronically absent at SF Community School? And how might the school or the district support those students and families to reduce absenteeism? So the initial definition, or I should say the initial impetus for this, is probably things we all as teachers, administrators, community members know. Factoids in relation to why it's very important for students to attend school, and critical that we examine why they're not. Chronically absent students are more likely to drop out. Truancy is a predictor of substance abuse later in life. Students with regular attendance have better academic outcomes, we know that. And ironically, a lot of the students who are chronically absent are also the ones who suffer from various types of learning challenges, including ELL students and low SES students, and often actually students who have learning disabilities. So it's a very meaningful problem to address. This quote that comes from the New York Times article just a couple of days ago, it was kind of fortuitous that it just appeared there, about chronic absenteeism, also mentions something that I think is critical, that school is not just about learning facts and spitting it back on tests, although we often sort of delude ourselves about that, but it's also about social emotional learning. In fact, maybe that's even more important than the intellectual component of it. And that when young students in particular miss school, 5 and 6-year-olds even in kindergarten, they are effectively delayed in their socialization. And this is not a slight against the homeschooling world, but rather just to say, the research is pretty clear that it's not just intellectual deficits that follow here, it's social emotional. And that predictably, students even as young as 5 and 6 who struggle academically, maybe are held back because they miss school, eventually in disproportionate numbers to the regular population end up dropping out of high school. So it's an important problem. I looked at some baseline information at SF Community School, just some background for the school. And by the way, I am not a teacher in the school, I'm not a member of the community, so it was a little more challenging for me to sort of obtain this information and, let's say, become more acculturated to the place. I teach at a private school while I'm pursuing my credential, my administrative credential here, with the hope that at some point I'll be a leader in public school in SFUSD. So Nora was kind enough, the principal, to let me do some research and find out some of these things. So we've got about 290 K-8 students in the school, and predominantly students of color. Latino is the dominant group, and you can see the others there. It's an interesting school in that it's a pretty collaborative, forward-thinking school in terms of how they do their teaching, a lot of integrated learning that goes on there, cross-subject, interdisciplinary learning, and the governance structure is actually quite different. They only had a principal in about the last 8 years, 5 to 8 years. Before that, it was a teacher group, basically, who led, a little unwieldy, democratically speaking, but effective in their eyes. But they decided to go with the principal model. And it's been a pioneer in restorative practices in SFUSD as well. So you can see the mission there, which is quite similar to many other similar schools. The absenteeism statistics that come out of the district reports put it actually in a fairly good position, although Nora is rightly concerned with that percentage, and it's 8% of the students who are chronically absent there. By comparison, the district is actually in fairly good shape. The average in San Francisco Unified is about 10%. At SF, and I'm calling it SFCS, lots of acronyms here, about 34 total students last year were chronically absent, which is, the district's definition is 10% of total school days missed. So if it's 180 days, 18 days of absence. But processes kick in long before that, or theoretically kick in, to sort of alert a system about that. We'll get into that later. Predominantly those students who were absent were low SES Latino and Hispanic students. Now, just for more comparison's sake, the school, SFCS versus the district as a whole, if you look at this chart, you can see that the chronic absences at SFCS are predominantly from the Hispanic Latino group and SES, low SES, and actually the special ed group, SPED kids, were very high on that list. If you compare that to the data district-wide, the numbers are a little different. And overall, as I mentioned, higher in the district as a whole, but with slight differences among different groups, different ethnic and racial groups. So what I did is put together a list, and I asked Nora for some help. And she gave me the use, and I should say the time, of actually one of her staff to make some phone calls. And we identified the top 15 chronically absent students this year, some of whom were on the list last year. And these are two slides which show the student's name, which I changed, the grade they're in, number of tardies or absences, excused and unexcused, primary reason, this is the column that we were trying to fill in, and the total number of days absent just this year. So these 15 phone calls, perhaps somewhat predictably, only yielded about 8 responses, about half the group, a little more than half the group. And you can see here, leaving the message part, actually there was a family, believe it or not, of 3 kids in the top or bottom, depending on how you think about it, most absent, most chronically absent group. They tend to be, and I'll show you the next slide here, either native Spanish-speaking folks or health issues. And the original impetus for this project, as I mentioned before, was transportation. Is there some sort of challenge around that? And the reality is, it came out that there's not that big of a challenge for this particular school. There are many in San Francisco because of the commutes a lot of the kids have to make across town with the way they do the lottery system there. But at this school, not so much. It's really a mix of issues, varied issues. Many of them can be boiled down into culture, family systems, or just particular problems and challenges within a particular family. No primary reason. So what to do about all this? As you know, traditional approaches to absenteeism, chronic absenteeism, this is a quote, by the way, from SFUSD's Student Parent Handbook, have tended to be more on the punitive side. I say here progressive warnings, then threaten parents. And I think that there's, while many districts, and certainly SFUSD, have moved in a more supportive, let's say, positive direction, the stick part remains, even in what's called the SARB, S-A-R-B, the Student Attendance Review Boards, which results if you end up taking quite a while to get your families, are absent chronically, over I think 9 absences, they have this review, and ultimately it becomes a district attorney situation for the parents. In my personal opinion and experience, not the right way to go. What else? They have school site resources. They're very few though. Typically schools in SFUSD don't have any person who's dedicated full-time or even partial time to doing anything other than entering the data that's required by the district. In terms of following up with families and finding out why, it's fairly limited, except at the district level, where there are people, but believe it or not, in a district of 55,000 plus students, there are 7 total people devoted to this job. 7 people keeping count of, or trying to support individual schools like SFCS in dealing with their chronically absent students. They don't really work as caseworkers. They are sort of overall supporters and community resource links to the extent that they can, but it's quite challenging. One of those links is an organization called TARC, Truancy Assessment Resources, but I found this one is actually primarily geared toward high school, and which is kind of where the classic image is of the kids that we need to help. They won't graduate from high school is the thought, but the reality is, as pointed out earlier, it actually has to start much earlier, and the resources devoted to that are fairly limited. So if we all acknowledge chronic absenteeism as a problem, 10% in SFUSD, 29% truancy in the high school in San Francisco, and 79% high school graduation rate, why do we under-resource it so much? And just for comparison's sake, you can see that at SFCS, English learners are 30% of the population, SPED, 13, GATE, etc. And yet, the resources devoted to those problems are, by comparison, immense. In other words, the time, effort, energy, money devoted is significantly more than absenteeism. And yet, and here's another approach from an article in the New York Times recently, attendance review teams are found in places like Connecticut and other states that actually put a little more resources into these teams through hiring people to engage with parents, outreach workers, beyond what's going on in SFUSD district. A lot of progress can be made. And the concluding slide here is that no solution will work completely, but why would we continue this imbalanced allocation of resources favoring instructional programs when 10% of the students aren't even there to receive those? In San Francisco Unified at least, and across the country it varies obviously by city, state, etc. But it's a significant problem and community resources need to be brought to bear more effectively on it. That's it. Thank you.